BRICS, BRICS, BRICS. All anybody in South Africa can talk about right now is BRICS. And no, not the construction mafia kind that currently has the country in its grip, and we really should be talking more about that. No, they're actually talking about the BRICS summit happening in Sandton, Johannesburg right now, involving some of the world's most powerful leaders from China, India, not Russia. I'm so relieved that Vladimir Putin isn't coming anymore. Brazil and South Africa. And it's been crazy to me to see how suddenly in the last few months, weeks, and days, South Africans have become completely obsessed with this international organization of countries called BRICS. People are talking about how BRICS is going to change, maybe even save the world economic order, how it's going to finally destroy American imperialism. People are talking about a BRICS currency. But what I've also found is that many people, even the ones who are talking, have no idea what BRICS really is, what it really does, or what it's really planning to do. So this is the issue with BRICS. First, why suddenly so much interest in BRICS? Answer's pretty simple. People across the world are fed up with the West. So many countries are victims of Western colonialism and Western neocolonialism. You know, the way that all the colonizers left but somehow managed to make it that all of their former colonies are still fundamentally dependent on their economies? America has been the world's policeman since World War II, and they and the West, particularly Europe, have promised that under their world order, people in poverty-stricken countries are going to get better lives. But really what's happened in most formerly colonized countries is that very few people have got wealthier. And usually those few people are elected government officials who the US and European nations personally enrich in exchange for getting big government contracts, getting access to mineral resources in Africa, advancing the West and the First World's trade interests in those countries using their elected or sometimes coup-created government power. And we all know that the Western superpowers pick winners. They very, very often undermine democracy. They take out leaders, democratically popular elected leaders of different countries that they disagree with when they'd rather have somebody else in power to advance their own interests. And we don't even need to look at the history books to know this. Just last year, John Bolton, a former high-ranking US official, admitted that he organized coups in other countries.
Somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but, other places.
For me, it's just how comfortable he is saying that, how arrogant and secure in his own power he is, that he can just say, as somebody who helped plan coup d'etats, not here, but in other places. So obviously people around the world, and particularly in Africa, are fed up, absolutely fed up with the United States and with the West. And in the last few decades, there's been a massive change because the rise of China, the rise of India, and Russia's aggressive courting of African countries for business and diplomatic alliances has suddenly meant that poorer countries don't have to work with the United States. They don't have to do everything that US and European countries say and just take the best deals available from those dominant economic superpowers. More and more, a movement, or at least a feeling in many societies, is developing that, screw the United States, we want a new way with new partners who are more on our side, and that's where BRICS comes in. In the early 2000s, an economist working at Goldman Sachs of all places, his name is Jim O'Neill, he wrote this paper about developing economies that he predicted in the next handful of decades could rise to become economic superpowers. And he came up with the term BRIC, because he mentioned Brazil, Russia, India, and China. He saw in those countries huge populations, significant resources, developing industries, and the potential to become economic superpowers. And suddenly the concept and the name BRIC became really sexy because all the leaders of these countries wanted to prove that they were the next hot places for massive growth. And so in the mid-2000s, they started having meetings. The first one was arranged by Russia, just the 4 countries, and they started to talk about creating some kind of organization or strategy for those countries to work together. And many different other countries were spoken about as maybe being the 5th member. And in the end, South Africa was chosen. We were hot property at the time because of our vast mineral resources and also because we were seen as the gateway to improving and developing economic and socio-political relations with the rest of the continent. So we became the S. Kind of the afterthought, let's be fair, but we were the afterthought S, and we suddenly were clubbed together with 4 countries with vastly bigger populations than us, vastly bigger and better developed economies, and more powerful political heavyweights in the global scene. But Mandela was still alive, we were hosting the World Cup, people definitely still listen to us, way more than they do now. So BRICS has been around for a little bit more than a decade, and it's mainly revolved around a series of summits, meetings with BRIC nations, trying to forge better economic relationships with each other. At every BRIC summit, there are tons of workshops and panels and representatives from different industries from all the countries meeting to try and create trade agreements. And what we do know is that trade has increased between BRIC nations in the last 10 to 15 years. It's hard to tell whether it happened because of BRICS or would have happened anyway. So for example, Brazil has done so much trade with China recently, but the Chinese would have tried to trade with Brazil anyway because Brazil has very significant mineral resources that all of the Chinese factories really need. The biggest achievement that BRICS has done is definitely the New Development Bank. It's basically a slush fund of foreign currency, $100 billion in currency that the BRICS nations have pooled together, and any of those BRICS countries can use some of that money in emergencies. South Africa actually borrowed tons of money from this fund during COVID to handle the economic shock. Now that's massive, and maybe some of the increased trade between the BRICS countries is because of the BRICS organization. But people are skeptical because very often all that comes out of BRICS summits is a lot of vague, non-specific agreements. And it's really hard to tell whether those agreements turn into anything valuable. But people are really excited about what they think is the potential for what BRICS could become. That's why there's so many countries applying to join BRICS. That's why there's this hope that maybe BRICS can be a genuine rival to the superpower Western economies. So let's look at the potential for what BRICS could actually become. The problem with BRICS' potential is that all of these massive countries are fundamentally self-interested, and they've got way higher priorities on their lists than working to a common good that is BRICS right now. For all of their posturing, China and the United States make so much money off each other and have such deeply entrenched business ties that it's not realistic to expect China to suddenly throw that out of the window and try and create a new world order by cutting off or undermining the United States. India has no interest in jeopardizing their relationship with the US either. They make an enormous amount of money off of their trade and interactions with the United States of America. They're currently trying to replace China as the world's factory, from call center to factory floor. That is what India is trying to do. India also has serious military ties with the US because the US's way of trying to handle that area of the world is to provide military equipment to India and their arch rivals Pakistan. Brazil is a classic example of how countries don't have consistent interests because they change presidencies and ruling parties. The last ruler, Jair Bolsonaro, had a very different vision for Brazil and in the world to their new president, Lula. And Brazil's whole model for how they're structuring their country and its role in the world has now changed. And these countries all have weird direct relationships too. They're not all fighting for the same goal. Russia has, for the entire Ukraine war, tried to get China fundamentally on its side, but the Chinese have said no. India and China are in a simmering, perpetual border dispute that does come down to actual warfare, battles and fighting quite often. Russia and China are both independently battling the United States of America to gain economic and political influence over African and poorer countries elsewhere in the world. And there is no way that any of these BRICS nations will jeopardize their own economic and political interests. No matter how many poor to middle income countries join BRICS, that will never be enough economic prosperity to rival trading with and doing business with the US, the Eurozone, the massive conglomerate countries like the G7 organization or even the G20. And we've seen from South Africa's perspective an attempt to play nice and be friends with everybody. Ramaphosa just this weekend spoke about South Africa being non-aligned, trying to keep business going with China, with Russia, with the US. So it was already super complicated with just the original 5 member states. But now, just this morning on the final day of the 2023 BRICS Summit, they announced that 6 new members will be joining BRICS on the 1st of January 2024. And it's an extremely interesting mix and extremely complicated because added to the group are Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Suddenly, BRICS looks so much more interesting, but also so much more complicated. First off, BRICS has now added some of the world's most powerful countries outside of Europe and the United States because they've added some of the world's biggest oil producers that they are. And Saudi Arabia is particularly fascinating because for the first time, Saudi Arabia formally joining BRICS is essentially saying to America and the West, we're going to play all sides. You need us. You need our oil for your economies. And so we're going to go over here and have a formal political agreement with some of your direct rivals, Russia, China. And we're just going to play everybody because you all need us. But the direct politics between these countries is also so complicated. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been at simmering rivalrous non-war Cold War for decades. And it's definitely a huge win for Iran to get into BRICS because of the huge sanctions, pressure, and international isolation the US and Europe has been putting them under for a long time. The UAE, super powerful, massively oil-rich Emirates. Egypt and Ethiopia, new, very significant African additions to BRICS. But what about the elephant in the room? The country in Africa with one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. The country which is by far Africa's most populous country. 1 in 6 Africans is Nigerian. And yet, we have Ethiopia instead. That is very sus. There must be some kind of direct politics rivalries going on that meant that Nigeria wasn't involved. Argentina is a very interesting one for me because yes, they are probably after Brazil, South America's most significant and powerful country, but they're also going through an economic crisis and are saddled with loans and in a very difficult moment. And there's the fact that Argentina and Brazil have been fighting for supremacy over South America for the longest time. Another very uncomfortable direct relationship that is now brought into BRICS. And so what is BRICS' potential now? That it represents even more money, even more powerful interests, and even just more people around the world. It's really hard to say. But the BRICS we know from the last 14 years is over. This new BRICS, very interesting. But the one capital I idea that's going around a lot at the moment is what if we created a BRICS currency that all of the BRICS member states use, just like with the euro? And the idea behind it is that, unfortunately, the way that international trade works these days is you need to buy and sell goods using a common currency. And that for the longest time has been the US dollar. And that's because the US dollar has been from the country which has been politically and economically dominant in the world for decades and decades and decades. And people really don't like that. And I totally understand why they don't. Because it means the US Federal Reserve has a massive amount of influence over world trade. Because the decisions that the United States government and its banks are making affect the value of the dollar, which affects everybody else's ability to trade in it because the dollar value of their currencies is changing and it's beyond their control. And this happens a lot. A very easy overnight or one-day change in the rand's value related to the dollar can suddenly mean that you're making way less money from your export or having to pay way more for your import. And so there is this big push to try and get people using different common currencies instead of the dollar. But what about a BRICS currency? People say that that means if everyone is using this currency, it will make trade incredibly easy because you don't have to change currencies at all, just like in the Eurozone. And it will also reduce the power and influence that the dollar and therefore America has over so many countries and traders and business people around the world. So now you might be thinking to yourself, why isn't a potential BRICS currency even then on the agenda at the BRICS summit happening right now in South Africa? Because it's not. Because the BRICS currency is not going to happen. Remember that economist Jim O'Neill who I mentioned earlier? He was quoted this week saying that the idea of a BRICS currency is literally, his word, ridiculous. And whether you listen to Jim O'Neill or not, it doesn't seem like it'll ever happen. And there's a simple reason why. For countries to give up their own currencies and all start flipping over into a common zone, like the Eurozone that uses a common currency, all those countries would have to willingly give up massive amount of control over their own money. And they'd have to figure out a way to have one central governing or reserve bank. And that's just never gonna fly, particularly with the hyper-dominant countries. Why would China, who always has used very specific control of its own currency to stimulate or look after its local markets and work in the interests of their own business people, why would they ever do that? And the return on that sacrifice is nothing to them. It's also hyper complicated to share a currency because you become vulnerable to the political choices of other countries in your bloc. So say there was a BRICS currency and Russia was in it. Russia is currently at war with the Ukraine. They've been shut out of one of the international payment systems that exists by the United States and can't use it, and they're under heavy sanctions. Now, what would happen to us right now if we were using the same currency as Russia and it started getting slammed by very consequential international sanctions, it would affect us. And there's also a strong argument that this wouldn't be good for poorer countries in a potential BRICS currency zone anyway. And we have a good example to look at. It's Greece in the Eurozone. Because the way that most currencies interact with the economies of a country is like this. If a country is struggling and its economy starts to become uncompetitive, the value of its currency drops. But if the value of your currency drops, that means that it is cheaper for people in other countries to buy your stuff and to work with you, which thereby brings in business and stimulates your economy again. But what if you're uncompetitive relative to other countries, but because you're part of a bloc, your collective currency doesn't lose value when you're uncompetitive? Your shared currency largely keeps its same value, and you remain uncompetitive. So there's no reason for anybody to come in and work with you, buy your goods, and develop industry in your area. And so you get screwed. Greece was part of the Eurozone, suddenly became a very sluggish, uncompetitive economy. And so they didn't have their own currency to lose value, which make it a better deal to trade and work with them. The euro stayed the same. And Greece was still competing with hyper-efficient economies that were very powerful. And that's part of the reason why Greece spiraled so disastrously and are in such a bind. Now imagine South Africa in a similar economic dynamic, but South Africa's economy is pea-sized and China's economy is bigger than a watermelon. If South Africa stagnates, but China keeps flying as the dominant member of this bloc, we're in trouble. So, what's the big deal with BRICS? Well, the big deal with BRICS this year, as in the last 12 hours, is that BRICS is radically changing. It was already an interesting organization. It was unclear how much value it had, how important it was. I still don't think the new BRICS will be top priority for any of these countries. All these countries are ultimately self-interested, and BRICS is just a neat, symbolic, and potentially economically rewarding part of their overall aspirations for their roles in the world. But now this new BRICS, with these 6 new countries, we're going to need a new acronym, is really interesting. I wonder what it's going to become. There's so much it could turn into. Or it could just be new BRICS, the same as it's been. Largely symbolic, some economic benefits, maybe a lot of help for a lot more countries with the BRICS Bank and the loans to help them out of emergencies, but not much else. We'll have to wait and see. So that's the issue with BRICS. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of The Issue with Dan Corder. We'll be back next week with another episode on what is hottest and most worth talking about. That's South African news with laughter and thoughtfulness. If you like your podcasts and want a longer discussion of all of the things that we cover on these episodes of The Issue, you can find us on Spotify and all other streamers.